The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Greetings from Albuquerque, New Mexico, and welcome to another 1615 webinar. I'm Matthew Ellison, the president of 1615 Church Missions Coaching. Today's webinar is entitled Rethinking Short-Term Missions, Vital Ingredients for Systemic Change. Over 2 million people are participating in short-term mission trips each year from North America. Many are very effective in ministry, while others are causing more harm than good. In this webinar, we will explore the vital ingredients needed for short-term missions to have lasting global impact. We will share practical resources and give opportunities for discussion, and also share some of our own experiences with short-term missions. We hope that you will not only be blessed by what you hear today, but that you will learn how to leverage the potential of short-term missions endeavors to make deep and lasting spiritual impact. Today's subject matter expert is a close friend of mine, Denny Spitters. He's the Vice President of Church Partnerships at Pioneers. The mission of Pioneers is to mobilize teams to glorify God among unreached peoples by initiating church planting movements in partnership with local churches. We sure do thank Denny for being with us today. In just a moment, I'm going to hand the microphone over to Denny, but first, a couple of details. Your phones are muted to preserve sound quality. You can listen through your computer speakers, or you can call in on the telephone. As questions come to mind, please type them in the question and answer panel located in the GoToWebinar task panel on the right-hand side of your screen. We will be addressing questions for the last 15 minutes of our time together, maybe 20 minutes. Over 88 people are registered for today's live webinar. I want to remind you that this webinar is also being recorded and will be available for listening at 1615.org in the next few weeks. I'll be turning it over to Denny now. This takes just a minute. And Denny, we're going to let you take it from here.
Thanks, Matthew. Good to be here with all of you today, wherever you are and whatever you're doing. Blessings on you. Trust that this will be an encouragement and will challenge your thinking about short-term missions. You know, if we think about short-term missions, it's a relatively new thing in a sense, even though we see different evidences of where those things might have happened in the New Testament. I remember the very first time that I did a short-term experience. It ended up being for 3.5 months. I came back at 18, way back in 1971-ish, and it totally rocked my world. It changed everything about my vision and future, and we know that they can have a really good cause and effect. With the sheer volume of numbers of people going and the volume of dollars that are being spent, however, it's really important, I think, that we come as organizations, churches, and individuals to rethinking our short-term missions projects and experiences. Matthew and I were talking the other day, and between the two of us, we probably led somewhere between 40 and 50 trips to all over the world in different places, and probably organized between 100 to 200 of those in various roles within the church, and Matthew even had a ministry doing this very thing. So we realized that this is a big deal, and we hope to share some things today that might be an encouragement to you and at the same time really be a challenge to you. A lot of what we're going to talk about has to do with something that I'm going to go backwards here a second just on the slides. The resource actually is Short-Term Missions for Long-Term Partnership by Daniel Rickett. Now, this thing came out in 2008, and he wrote about a lot of research that was being done at the height, I think, of when short-term was really peaking in 2005, 6, 7. So some of our stuff today that we're going to talk about based upon this is older. And we might think, well, to be honest with you, I'm wondering if things have gotten better. Here's some of the things that Daniel brought up that I think are very, very legitimate and important for us to think about. He asked some great questions surrounding the whole idea that he had read during that time frame in 2008 of slum tourism that was happening in Kenya, and specifically it was happening, in the Kibera slums, and it was actually tourism that was taking place. And he's like, wow, what's happening with short-term, and is that kind of what we're moving toward? Are we tourists or are we God's missionary people? And what is God's intention through the short-term mission movement? Will the spectacle, so to speak, of the short-term missions movement reveal us to be God's people, missionaries, or will we be reviewed and viewed as the plutocrats of globalization, as he put it? And then he began to ask some other questions surrounding it. What is the purpose of short terms? Shouldn't it be to enable the church to be the church in today's global neighborhood, to announce Christ, to love our neighbors, and put God on display as the greatest of all gods and the one to whom we would give praise? And is short term really doing that well? And I think those questions are just as valid today and just as important. And he noted just a growing sense of research that showed these things, and I think they're still good things to grapple with today. Short-term missions tends to reinforce stereotypes and deepen misconceptions many times about the poor. Also, that it's likely to increase the ethnocentrism that we have rather than decrease it. Of course, ethnocentrism being the whole idea that my culture and who I am in my culture is really the best, and it is the focus of what God is doing. It is the focus of the world's experience. And furthermore, he says it tended to show that interethnic relationships, when people came back home from the field, weren't very strong. They weren't really linking to diaspora when they came back. Wow, this is really going to change me. What a great experience. But then nothing's happening once people have returned. Then people with extensive short-term experience, he pointed out, were no less materialistic than those who had never been to the field on a short-term trip. And also that they had little appreciable impact on giving within the church or outside of the church from individuals. It doesn't even seem to have any sort of increased financial support for career service or people that are going, and actually might even be siphoning money away from that. So those are pretty strong things that the research was showing, and I think is one of the reasons that we can start to think and rethink about short-term missions. And I can honestly say, in my own experience in being a worship pastor and mission pastor at a church where we did a pretty fair amount of short-term, I was brought up pretty quickly to have to reevaluate things when we sat back and looked holistically and positively and critically at what we were doing and why we were doing it. And of course, we all know what's wrong with short-term missions. They're short. It feeds a quick fix mentality. It's a notion that missions can be short and they can be effective, and those are questions that we really have to bring to the table and then ask this. How is short-term missions a part, and how can it be and how should it be an effective part of God's agenda for the church, especially the Western church, and all the opportunities that we can have in this day and time. So that's what we're going to look at. And I appreciate the time that you spend here today. I'd like to start with talking about the vital ingredients. And I would say this one right here is really a very foundational piece that many people overlook and want to get into tactical issues right away about here's how we could do short-term missions better. But I would say that this is much more foundational and is absolutely critical to where you're going in short-term missions and how you're designing those experiences. Number one, being a clear missions definition that provides a foundation for healthy and systemic change. So Stephen Covey says if the ladder's not leaning against the right wall, every step we take just gets us to the wrong place faster. Having the right foundation for why we're doing short-term mission is critical, and it comes out of having a clear definition that provides clear vision and allows us to engage with passion. I've chosen Proverbs 4:26, ponder the path of your feet, then all your ways will be sure. Matthew, maybe you could help me with this a minute. We talk about this often, that many churches just go to the experience. Let's just get it out there. Let's just send a bunch of people out. We'll see what sticks. We'll try a whole bunch of stuff. We'll do it by experiment. Americans are doers. Churches love to go and do projects like this. We'll just go do it, and then we'll see afterwards how it all turns out. And what I'm claiming today is that if you don't have sound foundation, you're going to really spend a lot of time, money, and energy and effort into something that's, might actually hurt the very work God's trying to do.
Yeah, I agree, Denny. One of the things that we say a lot at 1615 in our work with coaching churches is that knowing comes before doing, and it actually shapes doing. And I lifted that from somebody, but I love the saying. And it's true of short-term missions as well. We often jump into the tactics and the strategies and, logistics and all those things. But we really need to ask ourselves first, what is the fundamental purpose of our missions efforts? And, how do short-term missions complement that? And that's not only good for the mission field, so to speak, because it really puts our aim in tune with the gospel and the mandate that Christ gave to reach all nations. But then for those who go, if they understand the larger purpose, then that short-term mission becomes an opportunity to really disciple them into God's global mission. They understand that it's not just short-term, it's not just doing projects. It's about the gospel reaching every nation, every tribe, and every tongue. It's about a witness of Jesus among all peoples. And I firmly believe that short-term missions should align with, again, the revealed will of God in Scripture, that we take the gospel to all people groups. I'm not suggesting there can't be mercy. I'm not suggesting there can't be, mercy trips and compassion trips, but I believe they should complement a larger vision of what God is calling his people to accomplish. Again, it's good for the field because when you do your trip, you say, does this line up with what God's called us to do as a church, in reaching the nations? And, how do we explain and teach that to those who go so they view the short-term trip as a part of a larger learning experience of finding their role in God's big picture to reach all nations? So absolutely, Denny, I believe this is critical. The quote from Covey just nails it. If you don't know what you're trying to accomplish or where you're going on the short-term trip, you'll do just about anything.
Yeah, and I love that because it's not just about the place you're going to. It's really about where you're going with the entire experience and what you're really submitting to the Lord with that experience. I think often we don't claim even some of the promises that short-term missions could really bring because we've not focused on key pieces and such as the fellowship of the gospel being at the center of our relationships, the gospel itself being, and the advance of the gospel at the center of our shared aspiration of why we're doing this trip. It tends to focus sometimes on projects rather than that being at the core. And I would agree with you. We're going to move on, but the reality of this is found in Matthew 28, and that whole idea that Jesus called us and told us to go and make disciples of all nations. And discipleship really needs to be up at the center of this, no matter if we're going to a significantly unreached situation or we're going to, do a short-term trip, somewhere in the States. That's really, really critical. Let's take a look at some of that's a backdrop for the vital ingredients, and we're going to give some bullets now for our discussion to kind of help a little bit better. And the second would be stewarding resources strategically for vision and purpose-driven strategic ministry outcomes. Not only does this apply to the overall ministry of your church and ministry or missions focus of your church, but I think there are some very specific things that can really help in that regard. So here's a few things. Here's one thing. Many times people will say, I'm going to start with all the things you shouldn't do. I'm going to only do one. And I would plead with you. I would encourage you to look at your trips that you do as a church or as an organization and discontinue the short-term missions vacation experience. By that, I'm not saying you can't take a day. I've often done it where you've seen something that's of historical or educational or strong significance to understand the culture that you're a part of at that time. By all means, that can really be great. But make sure that the purpose of your trips you're going for isn't really focused on the whole idea that it's more a process of tourism, and you haven't outlined clearly what the expectations are that have been given by your hosts and by the receptors of your going there, and going with such an attitude that you're really, really prepared. I'm amazed at the number of places I have been where I have heard about and met people in ministry who have actually had to tear down the work of other groups that have come, that have not listened to their hosts, that have not come as servants as learners, that have had their own agenda to accomplish so that they can simply make a video that they can put up at Sunday on church in a couple of months, and everybody can kind of clap and feel good about that. Now, I don't mean in any way to sound harsh or that those things cannot be helpful or good, but many times when we dig down a little deeper, that's really the core purpose for why some of these things are done, and I think they're really they need to be re-examined. Second of all, design trips that produce fully engaged, globalized, Great Commission disciples. This goes back to what Matthew just talked about, and which Matthew 28 states clearly, the whole idea that this is about discipleship and making disciples, not about us doing our thing in some other place or transferring what we do well into places that we think they don't do well. So, you know, if you're going to have a real sense of globalized Great Commission disciples, there needs to be a strong component of understanding what your purpose will be to accomplish the ministry specifically outside of the project that you might be doing or may not be doing while you're there, so that the trip really has that overall vision and focus of making disciples. And, you know, that's when short-term serves long-term partnership, and when the gospel is the center and the common union of that partnership, then a real sense of mission can be advanced. And that's got to be right at the center. So design trips that produce that, not only from the goers, but from the receivers, if we could call them that we are going to be a part of. Thirdly, design gospel-centered ministry that advances both gospel proclamation and compassion and service demonstration. I've alluded to that right now. You know, make sure that there is great balance in what's expected of people as they're going as, quote, short-term missionaries, if you could say that, from your church or your organization. What are the expectations? How will they expect, and what are your expectations of them, and what should they expect of how they will be ministering through Christ and seeking to lift him up to the highest place? That might involve very strong prayer elements. That might involve a preparation to be able to give a clear testimony of the gospel. It may simply be giving the gospel in a very clear method and process that allows people to both see it as well as hear it. So I think that whole idea of designing gospel-centered ministry really brings things on track, and it takes the vision off from us and what we're doing onto the Lord and onto what is really best and right, especially what your hosts might need the most from those of you who are going. Once again, I would couch this very, very strongly that you go as servants and learners, that we are not going with the answers. The only answer we have is the work of Christ in us and the work of Christ on the cross, and we're seeking to come alongside either believers that we're ministering with there or unbelievers who have yet to understand or grasp the gospel clearly. So there needs to be a balance in this area, and so often I think there is not. It's all about going to paint a wall or going to raise a building or going to build a wall, and it really needs to come to some practical things. In fact, I would encourage you, those of you who have opportunities to send short-termers to key places around the world, that you think very strategically as to how you will connect and what your hosts really need. It's many times better to send 3 or 4 or 5 people, and it's getting more and more difficult in many contexts to send 15, 20, and 30 people on a massive trip. And, you know, a lot's changed in the world that has involved that, but I think that you would agree that those are some of the things that are changing. Matthew, you know, maybe you have some comments as well about what you've seen in this area, because you've seen a lot of different things.
Yeah, you know, a story just came to mind. If I can share it just briefly, doesn't always translate when you're doing a PowerPoint webinar, but I think it's worth sharing. I was doing a setup trip, if you will, for a large team that was going to be doing some ministry in India from my church. This is years ago, and was, you know, taking care of logistics. One of our convictions was we didn't want to bring this team in that really burdened our contacts and our hosts, because it was sizable. It was probably too big of a team, to be honest with you. But we decided we can't expect them to arrange lodging and transportation and all those things. And so we raised a little extra money, and I went out in advance, spent a week there building relationships and working with one of their main people, and said, look, we want to serve you. That's why we're here. And, you know, just you're talking about this life on life, not just projects, not just painting walls. And something happened that has always stood out to me, and it's been a great little piece of, you know, gold, I think, that I've shared with other people. But I was getting up early in the mornings because of the dogs and the chickens and all those things. And I went downstairs, and I was always looking for a cup of chai in the morning. And I spent time with some of the cooks who were out underneath this lean-to shanty making breakfast for, you know, the many indigenous workers that were a part of this particular ministry. And I did this for days. And then I started, you know, going in the lunchroom, and it's strange because they had me sitting at a separate table because I'm the guy from America, you know, and they were serving me fried chicken. I'm not exaggerating. And I said, no, I want to sit at your tables with you, and I'd love to eat the local fare. And so I started doing that. Initially, these guys wouldn't even make eye contact with me, Denny. But I continued to just do the life on life bit, you know, not just the project and, you know, not just accomplishing my goals. And the last day I was there, they asked me to share a devotion. And this guy, Ebenezer, said, this is Matthew Ellison. He's like Alexander the Great. He came, he saw, he conquered. And I'm like, oh, boy, what is he going to say about me? And he said, he conquered our hearts with his love. He sat at our tables, and he ate our food. And, you know, it just I mean, I melted, Denny. I couldn't believe it, but I didn't do anything. All I did was, it was presence. It was relationship. I don't know if that helps, but I just think, you know, tying that into some of these things you've talked about here, vacation with, vacation experience, short-term mission, vacation, etc. The life on life is by far the most impactful thing that can happen.
Yep. And it changes people on this side, so to speak, when we come back. You know, the things that stick out in my mind from 15 and 20 years ago are the individual people that I'm still praying for them. One that came to my mind the other day who's died and went to be with the Lord, a young man that I'll never forget him. The ability to pray together, to see him come to know Jesus was really huge. And, You know, that whole idea of life-on-life ministry, I just think of Matthew chapter 10 as a great example of this, where Jesus even sent out the 12, and when he did, he said, go into people's homes and eat what they serve you, whatever they put on the table, you know.
Right.
Don't go with all your preparation and everything else. Go to be servants and to be able to give the key, you know, keep the main thing, which is repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand, and bring peace to that house, etc. That's really a great example.
Yeah.
Here's some of the last of some of the vital ingredients about stewarding resources strategically. Many of you have a lot of experience in this area, and you could easily add to this from your experience. So this is kind of a broad look. How do we bring vision and purpose-driven strategic ministry outcomes? I would say another bullet point is design progressive and educational experiences that include preparation, debriefs, and next steps. Many people would say this relates to design or comprehensive administration or appropriate training, and I think all of those things are important. However, I think many times churches don't think about how to bring people along progressively in terms of experiencing cross-cultural, a cross-cultural missions experience that gives people a picture of what it might really be like, not only for the raising up of potential people to go, but in terms of the people who are not going, to really grasp very clearly what they're doing, so it's not simply a one-off experience that I'll never forget, and once in a while I'll think about it, but it won't change my life being back in my context. So, you know, having healthy preparation, great debriefs. I know people that say we debrief before we leave, and we debrief after we've come back. And I would say that's a great place to be, but having a well-designed trip where people are actually preparing in key ways, and you're seeking to not only grow your team together, whether it's 4 or whether it's 10, and making sure that people really are connecting and we're praying well, we're really kind of looking at the Bible, we're teaching, so that people are really grasping what mission really looks like from the Bible, and then having next steps for people when they return. Not only a great debrief, but okay, where are you going from here? What are your next steps? What have you learned? What has God said to you and spoken to you about? And how will it change the activity and the intentionality of your choices being back in your culture? And I think this is an area which many times none of us do a great job with, but it's the most important area to focus on. Helping people intentionally grapple with what their next steps are, encouraging them, holding them accountable, having them have that expectation actually before they go, that when you come back, it's not simply going to be, I got up and I gave a testimony in church, and I'll tell you, a moment for me was when I heard 3 kids in a row get up. They were senior high kids that had been on young people that had been on the trip, and both of them basically said this: wow, this changed my life. I just don't understand it. They have so little and we have so much. And then they basically sat down. And at that moment, I had a great check in my spirit that said, wow, if that's all that people are really getting from these trips, it's really not, we're really not accomplishing what God would like to do and driving those things forward. So I'm just going to have you look at some of the things that are here that are all potential resources for you. DeltaMinistries.com, especially, there's great stuff on their site that can really help you understand how to do a short-term trip well, or if you want to overhaul all of that and re-look at it, they have great resources. I would highly invite you to look at EngageGlobal.net. Engage Global exists to be a catalyst for long-term engagement of unreached peoples around the world by providing intensive world Christian training among multiple unreached people groups that are from the 1040 window and are living right in the Twin Cities. And it's a very reasonable experience. I would say, if I told Matthew the other day that if I were a mission pastor today in a church, that would be my #1 starter trip. You could have families go to it together as families. They'd gain so much. You could also send specific groups and have their start be they're really learning about what it means to be a global Christian and understand our global God by getting in touch with all of the groups that are in that region, Hmong, Somalis, a wide variety of different backgrounds and understanding, and get educated and exposure so that you can really get a grasp on what it means. I would highly recommend it. It would be my starter trip, so to speak, and nobody could go on trip 2 unless they went on that. I'd make it trip 1. That's how strongly I feel about it. I've been there. I've visited them. Rick Davis is their leader there, and they've got a great staff. It's a great experience. It's very reasonable to go to, and you don't have to get a visa out of the country to make a trip like this happen. Great place to start. Also, shorttermmissions.com. Once again, great opportunities and ways of looking at resources, training, preparation, and lastly, the whole idea of standards of excellence. That's the last one listed there, of short-term missions, kind of standards of excellence. And briefly, they've got great standards that you can measure what you're doing and what you do up to that are really healthy. They ask good questions. So you've got their particular kind of an overview is they talk about God-centeredness. An excellent short-term mission seeks God's glory and His kingdom first. Then empowering partnerships. An excellent short-term mission establishes healthy, interdependent, and ongoing relationships. Then mutual design. Also collaboratively planning really well each specific outreach for the benefit of all the participants. Comprehensive administration, doing that really well. Truthfulness and promotion. Appropriate risk management. I am absolutely flabbergasted at the number of trips that are taking place to various places around that have no risk management built into them whatsoever. They are unprepared for anything that should happen in terms of security risk or any sort of accident that could take place. There's no preparation. I've heard some real horror stories of churches that have gotten caught because they've spent no time thinking that through. And then qualified leadership. Who's going to lead? Training and developing capable leadership so that there's people of character and skill and value that really understand why they're there. And then the appropriate training for the team as a whole, equipping all the participants for the designed outreach and that we're in this together. The biblical, appropriate, timely training, and then thorough follow-through after coming back of debriefing and preparation. I would like to kind of finish up with just these 3 really quickly. I think the other thing is designing trips that develop healthy partnerships. I am also amazed at the number of trips done by churches who go repeatedly to different places because they've always done them that way. I call them sometimes, and others I've heard the term being used, repeat offenders. People go and go and go and go year after year after year, and they can't wait and they get all psyched up, but nothing happens from it past that. And I often ask, well, why do you go there, and why don't you connect? Do you have any missionaries in some of that part of the country or in other places of the world? And they're like, oh yeah. Well, why don't you do your trips to really connect to what their needs are and draw not only what they're doing deeper into your church and own that and partner with them, but really stimulate the work that if they need you in certain ways, you could do. And many times it's like, oh, I've never thought of that. I got to tell you a story of someone who I knew who said that their church actually did a short-term missions project to the country they were in. They found out about it 4 days before the team was to come, and they had never been contacted at all, and they called the church and the leadership and said, hey, I hear you're coming to our country. You know, is it possible we can at least see each other for a day? And it totally threw the church for a loop. They hadn't even thought of it. And it really, of course, was a bit disconcerting to the worker on the field. I think if you want to develop healthy partnerships, not only with workers that are being sent from the U.S. to other places in the world, but healthy partnerships themselves with people on the ground in key areas, that would go a long, long way. In fact, Matthew gave a great example of how that can look. And then I would say connect strategy of trips to the center-supported field workers and national leaders is a part of that. And we just talked about that. And connect to the diaspora region, nation for exposure to unreached peoples. You know, Engage Global does that right here. It's possible to do that. Many of you already are living in contexts where the diaspora are either right in your backyard or close to you, and this would be an excellent way to connect with not only maybe the people group that is near you or the religious group that lives in your region, whether it's Muslims or Hindus, but could also connect very directly and strategically to a vision that God might give you for the unreached outside of the U.S. context. Matthew, I'll let you maybe kind of give, we were talking the other day about the church that you said was kind of interested in Turkey and what they were doing both locally and wanting to do internationally.
Yeah, this church has a real passion for Turkey, and they are currently exploring the unreached there. Whether or not it's a people group focus or regional focus remains to be determined, because Turkey is, you know, there are some Turkish unreached peoples, but some of them are like 50 million. So we're trying to help them figure out where they're going to focus in country. But they've decided that they want to connect to the Turks in the United States. They live in Fairfax, Virginia. And so a big part of their vision right now is finding out what's happening right there. And there's several thousand Turks that live right, you know, in their own backyard, so to speak. And they're exploring ways to interact and build relationships. And then also they're contemplating New York. You know, you mentioned the diaspora. There's 80,000 plus Turks in New York. That was really one of the first places that the Turks immigrated to. And so they've talked about, you know, that might be their short-term experience because they're not going to send the masses overseas. So it's an integrated vision. You know, it's short-term experience in New York and even just some life-on-life opportunity right there where they live. And so I really love how they're taking these short-term exposure opportunities and making them part of a bigger vision that they have to see the unreached in Turkey won to Christ. They're doing some picnics. They call it the Turkish Picnic, and they're right next to them. It's just kind of a divine serendipity. There's a group of Turks that meet periodically, and they picnic at this park. So, you know, it's as simple as that. They're just starting to build relationships with these people.
You know, maybe we could go to some questions and then talk a little bit more about things that people are wondering about or have experience in. I want to make sure that this is well balanced. Short term has enormous potential to equip God's people to become, you know, true participators in what God is doing worldwide as global believers, and to connect to brothers and sisters around the world, as well as to the unreached who have yet to even have access to the gospel. And I want to let you know, I probably hear at least 150 testimonies a year of people that are seeking to take next steps to go to unreached, difficult places. And I rarely hear someone give their testimony. They'll talk about how they came to know Jesus, and the second thing we ask is, for them to tell about, why missions, and then how they learned about us. And when I hear them talk about why missions, almost every time someone says, this is what happened to me. I went on this short-term trip, and this is how God met me. This is what he showed me, and this is how and why he has kind of really formed my heart and drawn me into going to the nations. And I know that those things happen regularly, that those are life-changing experiences. I would say that those are a small, small part of the, if there's 2,000 or 2 million people going on trips from North America a year, and we were to multiply what I just gave you, that 150 by 10, and say it was 1,000, that's an infinitesimal part of the whole of what's going on in short term. And I think that we could, if we apply ourselves as the body of Christ, we can provide healthy foundation for great systemic change, and we can have some purpose-driven trips with some clear outcomes that will grow the passion for the nations that I think God really wants us to have as believers.
Denny, I just want to reinforce what you said. Obviously we surface some of the negative stuff today because there's negative things happening. But as Denny and I talked about this webinar, we believe in the potential of short-term missions to change a life. That God would get a hold of a person. I mean, my own life experience, my life trajectory was completely changed because of what God spoke to me and how he revealed himself to me on a short-term mission trip to West Africa. But I also have seen a lot of, as you've mentioned, short-term missions done poorly. So our hope is that, in hearing this information, that you really think about leveraging the potential of short-term missions to really have maximum long-term impact. And Denny, before we go to question and answer, I wanted to share something that Robertson McQuilkin gave to me years ago. He's just such a mission sage, such a great guy. He's still preaching the gospel, and he's still a mobilizer today. But he says, if you want to maximize the potential of short-term missions, he says, don't fall prey to the illusion that the short-term mission trip will finish the task. It is a small piece of a very large global endeavor. And he says you need to take 4 courses. And Denny, we hit on all these in this presentation. He says take 4 courses if you're going to do short-term missions. He says the first one is Orientation 101. He says study the culture. Be serious in your preparation, which we've talked about. And also Orientation 101, learn about the global heart of God. Learn about God's mission, so make that part of it. Orientation 101. Number 2, Reality Therapy 102. He says, die to your Americanism. Get out of your celestial bubble. Eat the food. Abandon the comforts of home. He said, be a servant. I love that. Reality Therapy 102. Tutorial 103. He says, be a listener and a learner, which you said many times, Denny. And then finally, postgraduate, he says, is a reentry strategy. He said, reflect. And he says, because short-term missions are expensive, what we really need to be asking is this. When you start that trip, every day ask, what does this experience mean for my long-term involvement in missions? What does this experience mean for my long-term involvement in missions? So really quickly, just Orientation 101, Reality Therapy 102, Tutorial 103, and then Postgraduate Reentry. Just kind of a way to distill all that we talked about into just 4 simple concepts.
That's excellent. Yeah, I like that a lot. Robertson McQuilkin's great.
He's a great guy. What a sage. What a sage. So, Denny, we are going to turn it over for some Q&A here. And just to remind everyone online that there is a question and answer panel in your GoToWebinar task panel on the right side of your screen. And if you type your questions in that section, oh, my goodness, we're loaded with questions already, Denny. Here we go.
Go for it.
So this is from Zabulin Matos. Oh, he says, brilliant, great presentation. Thank you, Zabulin. What percent, this is from Dave Hansen, what percent of people who go on short-term mission trips become long-term missionaries? And if it is low, why is that, Denny?
Well, I mean, I would be speaking anecdotally because I've not seen the recent statistics on this. It is very low. You know, I think it was the Robert Priest study that was done in 2006 where, if it's not his study, it was someone else, where it was really shown that because of a lack of purpose in trips and direction and vision and very much a lack of focus for next steps, and the very 104 that you said Robertson McQuilkin was talking about, of reflection and then, I believe, intentional action to go forward and accountability in that. Actually, there were people, there was a growing group of people that had been on short-term trips that actually were leaving the faith because they came back from such a high experience, quote unquote, and they came back to the realities of their own setting and their own context and their own church, and people really were very unresponsive. It caused them many times to be discouraged, and many of them were starting to actually leave the faith because what they saw with the engagement of God on the field and what they experienced in their own context had this huge void in between, the kind of Grand Canyon gap. So I would answer, why is it? I would say many times it's because there's not a reinforcement of that trip in the context that they're coming back to. And so once again, I would challenge churches and leaders to make sure that a regular part of how you're making disciples in your churches has the component of what it means to be on mission with God, not only in your context, but to consider what it takes to really provide opportunities for people to go cross-culturally, even within your own context, and continue to move forward in this.
Yeah, that is great stuff, Denny. Again, I think if you have a larger vision and an understanding of the role of the short term in, again, a bigger global vision for your church, you can see a really tremendous impact in the heart of those who go as well as the receiver. This is from Matt Whitaker. You mentioned preparing well for a trip by making sure the trip helps the field, but at the end of your positive points about STM, all had to do with growth individuals going. So what, if any, positive impact do you see short-term missions having in reaching an unreached people group? Great question, Matt.
Well, I'm going to let you jump on that, Matthew.
Here's what I think. This is where having the right field workers and partners is critical. Because if you do a short-term mission trip and you really don't have those anchor relationships in country, it's going to be hard to see any type of lasting impact among the unreached. So I think, again, it's talking to your missionaries that you're serving. I believe a short-term mission should be a part of a larger vision, which is why I don't like the idea of going to a new place every summer. If you're a church, you should be going consistently to the places where it's understandable and acceptable to have workers, and you should be complementing that work. And then, as you mentioned, Denny, talk to them. What is your work? How can we support and assist? Is there anything we can do? What's the best use of our time in field? How do we complement what you're doing? So I think when that happens, you can actually see some of those things take place. I'll give you an example. A church I'm working with in Overland Park, Kansas. I can't disclose where they're at in the Middle East because I don't know who's exactly tuning in today. But they have a business as mission initiative, and it is real business and real mission. And they're doing hair cutting. They actually have opened up a salon among some Kurdish peoples. Long story short, they bring business professionals from their church to assist and provide consulting, if you will, to that work in field. So, how do you take the gifts and talents of your people and, align them with the needs and opportunities that your field workers and partners have? That's a small example. Dan, I don't know if you have one to add to that.
Well, I think that's really key. Otherwise, it does feel like just a one-off. I would really encourage churches to consider doing regular process of working with a select few people or partners on the field, and really delving into those partnerships. And when you do, you'll develop trust, and hopefully you'll develop trust, and you will grow, and you will be listening to them. I often would stay back a couple of days and debrief with, if I was leading a trip. On some occasions, I'd have someone else, another leader, who was a co-leader, would lead them back to the States, and I would stay for a couple of days and we'd debrief, or I'd find a way down the road to debrief with them and kind of learn from them what they thought was positive and what was negative, and how we could work on this. I would really encourage churches to get kind of read up, so to speak, or educated up a bit on this. One of the great books I think that would really help you understand how to network and partner well together is called Well Connected by Phil Butler, P-H-I-L-L-B-U-T-L-E-R. That book alone will help you significantly in understanding how, what you're going into and how you can work. Another book would be When Helping Hurts. We'll just send the money. Will not go at all. Well, maybe not. And maybe sending the money is not exactly what you should do. Learn about what truly empowers people, and what are some of the things that are points of understanding and concern that you should have when you're evaluating what you will do. We've even done this on trips that I've been on. Oh, everybody leaves everything there. Well, what I didn't realize by giving everybody all the clothes on my back and all the money in my pocket was I created an expectation on my third and fourth trip.
Yeah, that's right.
And, that's not necessarily helpful either. Another book like Understanding How People Look Cross-Cultural Conflict by Elmer. I mean, there's a lot of great stuff, especially within the Christian community, that if you are going to be putting these things together and leading them, you ought to educate yourself and help yourself. Another one, African Friends and Money Matters.
Yeah, that's great.
That's
a must-read. Must-read.
Yeah. And you say, well, I'm not going to Africa. Well, I'll tell you what, if you read this, you will understand interdependent cultures in a way that is so unlike our world and what they're thinking about when they look at money versus what we do, et cetera. All of these can greatly benefit how you determine what your trips are going to be and what they look like.
Yeah, I want to recommend that book. If you've not read that book, he's an anthropologist. It is a must read, and it's true of any subsistence culture. You see those same issues in Asia, in Central America, South America, anytime you have a subsistence culture, and it will change the way you use money on the mission field, even though it's not a Christian book per se. Really important read. Someone else responded to Matt's comment here. It's kind of in keeping with what McQuilkin said, and that is that we have to really not fall prey to the illusion that short term will finish the task. The person's name is Saul, and he said, my experience is that short term is primarily for those who go. You're not going to reach the nations, but if they're done right, they can expose the need and, show people the heart of God for the world. Kind of what we were saying, Denny. So just a comment.
Yeah, that's I love to hear that from a brother who's experienced it firsthand.
That's right. Someone asked me to repeat the 4 classes or courses from McQuilkin. Actually, 2 people did, so I'm going to do that, okay? It's Orientation 101. Study the culture, and also study the Great Commission. Use it as an opportunity to teach people about God's larger global mission. Reality Therapy 102. Die to your Americanism. Be a servant. Get ready to step out of your culture. Abandon the comforts of home is what McQuilkin says. Tutorial 103, that is be a listener and a learner. Be a listener and a learner. And then finally, postgraduate 104 is reentry strategy, reflect. And the question that McQuilkin asked us, that everyone who goes on a short-term mission should ask themselves rather, is begin to ask God every day what this experience means for my long-term involvement in world missions. Ask every day of the trip, God, what does this experience mean for my long-term involvement in missions? Well, we have a couple more minutes if anyone wants to ask another question here. Some of them, let's see.
While they're coming up, let me just follow up on that. You know, I love what you just went through. Many times people are going to places in the world and it's like, oh, where are you going? Oh, we're going to Turkey. I'm like, oh, so what do you know about Muslims? Nobody knows hardly anything about Muslims. Why aren't they reading at least a couple of books about who Muslims are, how they think, preparing them, and maybe even having an actual Muslim come and talk about what it means to be a Muslim to this group? You know, there are all sorts of ways that people could prepare so that when they go, they're not, you know, they're not found wanting, that they actually understand the culture that they're into, and that some of the very faux pas maybe that Americans tend to bring and anyone else brings into another culture where you're brand new can be understood and can be wrestled with and can be responded to appropriately, as opposed to we just go, we do our thing. And that relates to the other things you talked about that Robertson you know, brought out very, very clear, that we're going as servants and learners. So any way that you can help people prepare to go on that trip, we would not send someone to the unreached in India that doesn't know anything about the culture that they're going to. I would highly question that they really have a passion for it if they've never read a book about them, if they've never researched about them. You know, the simplicity of even going online and, you know, getting the book of, the one that's real big, it's real thick, about the world, done by Patrick Johnston.
Operation World. Operation World.
Yeah, Operation World. I mean, at least go to that and look up the people group or the groups you're going to and learn all you can about it. Understand before you go, rather than go uninformed and unsensitized to what you're going to deal with.
Yeah, great stuff. A couple more questions here, Denny. Let me address a couple of questions that have been asked. This presentation will be downloaded to our website, and it'll be available for viewing and listening in just a couple of weeks. If you want the PowerPoint, we're happy to share that with you as well. Is that correct, Denny?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so we'll be happy to send the PowerPoint to anyone who requests, and there is no cost to view the recorded sessions. As always, our webinar resources are absolutely free. So about 4 or 5 people asked that. Again, it'll be online in a few weeks. You can watch it in a video format. It's actually recorded through GoToWebinar, and then we'll upload it to our website, and then we can send, if anyone's interested, we'd be happy to send you the actual PowerPoint itself. So one more question here, Denny. Actually, Trish, our Director of Operations, made a comment. She's going to post the names of the books you mentioned, Denny, as well as McQuilkin's 4 courses. We're going to download those to our website, I believe. I'll find out in a minute where exactly they will live on our website, but we're going to put some resources up on the website that have these books and other things that were mentioned. So let's see here. This is a great question from Regina Ford. Are there some good resources for doing risk assessments and crisis response planning for short-term missions?
I would say that probably the best resources you'll find are on Delta Ministries and shorttermministry.com. And in fact, in connecting on those sites, there's a few things that are already on there. Practically speaking, I would just ask you to think with great common sense about where you're going and what might be helpful. I learned very early on that I did not travel to international destinations with a group of people, whether it was 4 or whether it was 40, without having everybody on international insurance that would be emergency insurance. For the cost of what it was, I don't remember at that time what it was. I'm going to say it was $4 a day for, 7 days. For the 30 or 35 or $40, was huge.
Yep, that's right. In fact, someone just asked the question, do you recommend short-term insurance? And Denny just answered that absolutely. And they asked, if so, who? If you go to 1615.org, 1615.org, there is a couple of partners there that provide insurance specifically for Christian groups doing short-term missions. So you can go to our website and link to a few of those. Let's see. I am going to hit on a few things that are coming up here just to let our audience that, wow, we've had great retention. Almost everyone's online that started. So I want to let you know about several other resources that are available. We launched a new initiative this year called the Mission Table. And the idea is moving conversation that's going to move the church towards deeper engagement in missions. You can watch 2 episodes that have already run, and they're archived. Episode 3 will be on July 7th. It's called Missionaries Destroy Culture. We're surfacing ideas and getting people who have perspectives on both sides of those ideas. So they're very robust conversations. And there's some people out there that say missionaries destroy culture. We're going to unpack that idea. Denny is actually one of the table guests for that episode. We also want to let you know about other resources that we have online. Many webinars. We have many webinars that have been archived at 1615.org. And we have an upcoming webinar on July 22nd from noon to 1. It's called Internationals Among Us. And this really hits on those items that we spoke of about the diaspora. And Denny, you want to let us know about the Church Partner Forum?
Yeah, exactly. I would love to invite people to consider coming to our forum. You do not have to be a partner church with us. We're glad to engage you. This is a group of about 40, 45 people from usually about 20 to 22 churches. Multiple people can come from a church. This is a free event. Matthew is actually going to be the one who's featured at our November 10 to 12 Growing a Missions Engaged Church. The whole idea is demystifying your next steps. Like, where are you right now? Are the right things in place for you to really be moving forward? Have you developed a good foundation? And then lots of practical stuff, proactive sending and care. It's a quick couple days. If you'd like to know more, you can go right online there, and you can find out more at the website given for Pioneers, and feel free to contact me, and I'm glad to connect with you and tell you more if you're interested. There's no cost for this event. This is free to churches. It's our way of building their missions DNA and our way of encouraging them. We exist because we partner with local churches. Without local churches, we do not exist. So that's our way of giving back, and we'll be glad to have Matthew as a part of our next one.
It's a great experience. I just want to encourage any church that's thinking about deepening their engagement in missions, learning more. It's a really great way to spend several days in the Orlando area. I'm going to leave this slide up for a second. If you have any questions for Denny or I, or want to contact us, there's our contact information. I want to remind you that this webinar has been recorded and will be available at 1615.org in just a couple of weeks. Hey, Denny, thank you so much for your time, for your graciousness, for your wisdom. We really appreciate you taking time to share with us today. I'm Matthew Ellison for 1615. Thank you for listening.